The morning Evelyn Carter arrived at Caleb Thornton's gate, she had 14 cents in her coat pocket, bruises on her wrists from a man she'd trusted with everything, and a letter in her hand that called her someone else's problem. She didn't knock. She didn't beg. She stood at that gate in the July heat and looked the biggest, coldest man she had ever seen directly in the eye. And she said, "I'm not leaving. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel. Follow along until the very end and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels." The stagecoach left before Evelyn could change her mind. That was probably deliberate. The driver, a red-faced man named Holt, who smelled of tobacco and bad faith, had barely slowed the horses before her single trunk hit the dirt road with a sound like a coffin lid dropping. No assistance. No farewell. Just the crack of a whip and the diminishing rattle of wheels, and then the enormous silence of the Montana mountains, swallowing everything whole. Evelyn stood in the road. The sun pressed down on her like a physical weight, the kind of July heat that had no mercy and no shade. Around her, the frontier town of Coldwater Ridge was doing what small towns always do when a stranger arrives, watching, judging, and saying nothing useful. She picked up her trunk herself. It wasn't heavy. She had made sure of that. Back in St. Louis 3 weeks ago, when she had still believed she had choices, she had looked at the contents of her life, the dresses, the books, the small framed portrait of her mother, and she had chosen carefully. Take what you can carry alone, because from now on, she reminded herself, you will always be alone. The letter in her coat pocket crinkled when she moved. She didn't need to read it again. She had memorized every word. "Miss Carter, your presence is required at the Thornton property 7 miles north of Coldwater Ridge before the end of the month. A contract has been arranged. Mr. Thornton is aware of the terms. You have no other options. Do not embarrass yourself by refusing. W. Pierce, First Federal Bank of Montana. Not a request, a summons." Walter Pierce had made certain she understood the difference. Evelyn had spent 6 months trying to fight Pierce in court. 6 months of letters of appeals, of standing in front of judges who looked at her like she was furniture that had learned to speak. Pierce had taken everything: her school, her savings, the building she had spent 4 years turning into something worth being proud of. He had done it with 3 signatures and a law that said a woman's financial agreements required a male co-signer, and since her co-signer had vanished with half her money the previous autumn, everything she had built was legally his. The courts agreed with him. The courts always agreed with men like Pierce. So when his letter arrived, she had 2 choices. She could disappear, change her name, move somewhere smaller, start again with nothing and no one. Or she could follow the summons to a mountain ranch in Montana and figure out once she got there how to survive whatever came next. Evelyn Carter had never been a woman who disappeared. She adjusted her trunk and started walking. The people of Coldwater Ridge watched her from doorways and windows and the wide front porch of the general store. A woman in a yellow dress walking alone up the main road, pulling a trunk behind her in the summer dust. Nobody offered help. One man, heavy-set, wearing an apron that suggested he owned the butcher shop, actually laughed. Not quietly. The kind of laugh meant to carry. "That Pierce's girl," he called out to nobody in particular. "That's her." Someone answered from the hardware store. "Schoolteacher from St. Louis. Lost everything. Doesn't look like much. Reckon that's the point." Evelyn kept walking. She had learned something in the months since her life came apart. The people who laughed loudest at your worst moment were usually the same people who had never survived one. She filed the butcher's face away, in the part of her mind she reserved for things she would not forget, and she kept moving. The road north out of Coldwater Ridge climbed steadily, and by the time the town was behind her, the dust had turned to hard-packed earth, and the heat had settled into something that simply existed, permanent and indifferent. Pine trees began appearing along the ridgeline. The mountain ahead was enormous, the kind of landscape that made a person feel newly small in a way that was either terrifying or clarifying, depending on who you were. For Evelyn, it was clarifying. She had been made to feel small by people her whole adult life. At least the mountain wasn't pretending to be her friend first. She heard the ranch before she saw it, a horse's sharp complaint. The rhythmic sound of something heavy being struck. A voice low-controlled speaking words she couldn't make out, and then silence, and then the horse again. When the gate came into view, she stopped. The man standing on the other side of it was not what she expected. Evelyn had imagined something cruel-looking. Pierce's men usually were. She had pictured someone soft from money or hard from meanness. Someone who looked like what he was, a piece on a banker's game board, positioned to make her fail. Caleb Thornton was none of those things. He was standing beside the fence post with a length of rope in his hands, and he was looking at her the way a man looks at weather, assessing, calculating completely without sentiment. He was tall enough that the fence post beside him looked almost modest. His shirt was dark with sweat across the shoulders. His face was the kind of face that had spent years outdoors and carried every year of it. Deep lines, a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. Eyes the color of river water after rain. Dark and unclear and going a long way down. He didn't move toward her. He didn't move away from her. He just looked. Evelyn set her trunk down in the road. She straightened her back. She walked to the gate. "Mr. Thornton," she said. His voice when he spoke was quieter than she anticipated. Not gentle, just contained. Like a man who had decided long ago that words were expensive and he didn't intend to spend them carelessly. "You're lost," he said. "No," Evelyn answered. "I'm exactly where I was sent." Something moved behind his eyes. Not warmth. More like the recognition a man feels when he discovers the animal he expected to be tame has teeth. "Pierce sent you." "Pierce gave me a contract and a direction. I walked the rest myself." Caleb looked at the road behind her. He looked at the trunk sitting in the dust. He looked at her hands, and she knew what he saw. No calluses. Ink stains on her right index finger from years of teaching. A small scar on her left palm from a window latch that broke wrong 3 winters ago. The hands of a woman who had never once worked a ranch. "You should go back," he said, "before it gets dark." "I have nowhere to go back to." "St. Louis." "There is nothing left for me in St. Louis." His jaw shifted slightly. "I didn't agree to this." Evelyn reached into her coat pocket and produced the letter. She held it through the gate bars. "The contract says otherwise." He didn't take it. He knew what it said. Pierce had made sure of that too, had sent his own copy of the terms to Caleb's lawyer 3 weeks ago in language designed to be humiliating. "Mr. Thornton will accept placement of Miss Carter as a condition of his deferred loan payment. Miss Carter will remain on the property no fewer than 30 days. Failure of either party to comply will result in immediate foreclosure proceedings." Pierce had put Caleb on a clock, and he had given Caleb a woman he believed would break the clock for him. "1 week, Caleb said. Evelyn blinked. "The contract says 30 days. "I know what the contract says." He opened the gate, not with welcome, with practicality, the way you open a gate for something you intend to manage. "I'm saying 1 week. You prove you belong here, you stay. You can't, I take you back to town myself and you figure out your next move." Evelyn stood in the opening and looked up at him. Up close, he was larger. The kind of large that reminded you that some men were built for a world that no longer quite existed, a world where size and silence and endurance were the only currencies that mattered. She picked up her trunk. "All right," she said. 1 week. She walked past him into the yard. He watched her go. For the first time in 8 years, Caleb Thornton had someone on his land who hadn't been paid to be there. He wasn't sure yet whether that was better or worse. The cabin was larger than she expected, and emptier than she could have imagined. Not poor empty, not neglected empty. Caleb Thornton's ranch was meticulously maintained in the way that only deeply solitary people maintain things, because when there is no one to talk to, you talk to your work instead. Every tool in its place. Every surface clean. The kind of order that had been maintained so long it had stopped being effort and become architecture. But empty of everything human. No photographs on the walls, no decorative objects, no evidence that anyone had ever sat in the 2 chairs by the fireplace for any reason other than exhaustion. The kitchen held the basics. Flour, salt, coffee, dried beans, arranged with military precision on the shelves. There was a second room with a cot. The cot had a blanket and a pillow. That was all. Evelyn set her trunk at the foot of the cot and looked around the room for a long moment. She had stayed in worse. She reminded herself of that deliberately, the way she had been reminding herself of it for months. You have survived worse. Evelyn, keep moving. When she came back out to the main room, Caleb was at the table with a coffee cup and what appeared to be an account ledger. He didn't look up. Dinner, she asked. I usually eat at sundown. Is there a schedule for the work? Sun up, everything that needs doing, sundown. That's not a schedule, that's a philosophy. He looked up then, just briefly. Something in his expression said she had surprised him, but he recovered quickly. You'll figure it out. I'd figure it out faster if you told me what you need done. He studied her for a moment with those unreadable river water eyes. Then he set down his pencil and laid out the day in terms of tasks. Water from the creek for the horses, firewood split and stacked. Morning meal, fence line walked on the east pasture, afternoon meal, whatever needed doing that hadn't been done. Evening meal accounts. How many horses? Evelyn asked. 4 working, 2 resting. Cattle, 63 head, plus the calves from spring. She nodded, committing it all to memory. Who else works here? Nobody right now. His voice was completely flat. Last hand I had left in April. Why? A long pause. Said it was too quiet, Caleb answered. Said the mountain made him feel like something was watching him. Evelyn glanced toward the window where the mountain pressed its enormous shadow against the glass. Is it? Caleb picked up his pencil. Go to bed, Miss Carter. Evelyn. Miss Carter, he repeated with the weight of a man closing a door. She went to bed. She lay awake for a long time listening to the mountain breathe. She was up before sunrise. Not because she wasn't tired, she was bone-deep exhausted from 3 weeks of stagecoaches and bad boarding houses and the particular weariness of not knowing what was coming next. She was up because she understood something clearly. Caleb Thornton was waiting for her to fail. The whole arrangement was built on the expectation of her failure. Pierce needed her to fail. The town of Coldwater Ridge had already decided she would fail. If she slept in on her first morning, she would spend the rest of the week recovering the ground she lost. She built the fire herself, finding flint and steel on the shelf beside the wood box. She filled the large pot from the water barrel inside the door, noting that it was already low, which meant water from the creek was the first task. She set coffee to boil. She found eggs from the hens in the small coop behind the cabin. She nearly missed it in the pre-dawn dark, but she found it, and she had 6 eggs cracked and cooking by the time Caleb Thornton appeared in the doorway. He stopped. He looked at the fire, the coffee, the eggs. He looked at her. She put a cup of coffee on the table. How do you want your eggs? She asked. A very long pause. Doesn't matter, he said, and sat down. She cooked them the way she had always preferred, simple, nothing wasted, and she put a plate in front of him and sat across the table with her own. She drank her coffee. He ate without comment. Outside, the sky was just beginning to turn. After a while, Caleb said, "The creek is a 1/4 mile east. Follow the sound." "I know," Evelyn said. "I heard it last night." He looked at her again with that same expression from the gate, recalibrating. She was starting to understand that recalibration was the closest thing Caleb Thornton had to a compliment. She took the 2 buckets from beside the door and went to find the creek. The east fence line had 3 broken posts. Evelyn found them on her second full walk of the property and went back to the barn for what she needed. She had never repaired a fence post in her life, but she had spent 4 years teaching children how to learn things, and the principle was the same. Observe what a working version looks like, then replicate it. She spent most of the afternoon on those 3 posts. The work was harder than it looked. The ground was summer dry and resistant, and by the time she had the 3rd post set, her back was screaming and both palms were raw. She finished anyway. When Caleb came around the east pasture on horseback at late afternoon and saw her packing up the tools, he pulled up short. He sat on the horse for a moment, looking at the fence line. "You found those," he said. "This morning." "I would have gotten to them." "They're done now." He looked at her hands, at the torn skin across her palms. He said nothing about that either, but she saw his jaw tighten in a way that wasn't quite anger. "Come on," he said, finally turning the horse. "Supper." She walked back beside the horse without complaint. After a few minutes, Caleb said without looking at her, "You done any ranch work before?" "No." "Thought not." "I learn fast." Another pause. The horse's hooves were soft on the dry summer grass. "Where'd you learn fencing?" "I didn't," Evelyn said. "I looked at the posts that were standing and figured it out." Caleb was quiet for long enough that she thought he was done. Then, "You figured wrong on the angle of the third one." "I know. I'll fix it tomorrow." He looked down at her from the horse. Not with warmth. She didn't expect warmth from this man, not yet, maybe not ever. But with something that had shifted slightly from the cold assessment he had been directing at her since she arrived. "After breakfast," he said. "After breakfast," Evelyn agreed. They came back to the cabin in the long gold light of a Montana summer evening. For the first time in months, Evelyn Carter felt something that she had almost forgotten the name of. Not happiness, not safety. Something older and more reliable than either. She felt useful. 3 days into her stay, the trouble came to find her. She was hanging washing on the line behind the cabin, a chore so ordinary she had allowed herself to stop thinking for a few minutes, just moving and breathing and existing in the clean mountain air, when she heard horses on the road. More than one. She came around the side of the cabin and saw 2 men dismounting at Caleb's gate. They were town men, she could tell that immediately. Town clean, town dressed, but carrying themselves with the particular loose ease of men who were accustomed to doing things nobody stopped them from doing. Caleb came out of the barn. The taller of the 2 men, a young one with a narrow face and a silver watch chain, smiled at Caleb in a way that contained nothing friendly. "Thornton, Mr. Pierce sends his regards." "Pierce can keep his regards," Caleb said. The man with the watch chain looked at Evelyn. His eyes moved over her in a way that made her want to step back. She didn't. "This the woman," he said. "She doesn't look like much." "She's not your concern," Caleb said. His voice was still flat, still controlled, but there was something new underneath it. A stillness that was different from his regular stillness. A stillness that had direction. "Mr. Pierce just wants to make sure you understand the timeline," the second man said. He was older, thicker, with the look of someone who had spent years making things uncomfortable for other people without ever actually getting his hands dirty. 30 days, Thornton. If she walks out before that, the bank moves on the property. I know what 30 days means. And Mr. Pierce also wants to make sure the lady understands." He shifted his gaze back to Evelyn, and his voice got careful the way voices get when someone is enjoying being careful. "This arrangement is his generosity. She's here because he allowed it. She should remember that." Evelyn walked forward. She didn't know she was going to do it until she had already done it, moved from the side of the cabin to a position that placed her directly between Caleb and the 2 men. Not because she had a plan. Because something in the older man's voice had done the same thing to her spine that Pierce's voice had always done. And she had spent 6 months swallowing that reaction, and she was tired. "Tell Mr. Pierce," she said, "that I remember exactly how his generosity works. I remember it every morning when I wake up and every night when I go to sleep. I remember it better than he'd like me to." The older man's eyes narrowed. "This isn't your land, girl." "Not yet," Evelyn said. A silence. Then the man with the watch chain laughed short dismissive the same way the butcher in town had laughed, and the 2 of them mounted up and rode back the way they had come. Evelyn stood in the road and watched them go. After a long moment, she became aware of Caleb standing just behind her and to her left. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she had not yet seen on his face. It lasted only a second less, but she caught it before it closed again. "You shouldn't have done that," he said. "Probably not. Pierce's men don't forget that kind of talk." "I know." Then why? Because he needed to know I'm not afraid of him. She paused. And because I needed to know it too. Caleb studied her for another moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the barn. Lunch, he said over his shoulder. Beans aren't going to cook themselves. Evelyn almost smiled. She went inside to cook the beans. On the 6th day, Caleb's best mare got loose. It wasn't carelessness. A section of the paddock fence gave way during the night, a weak post that had been on Caleb's list and hadn't yet been reached. By the time he discovered it at first light, the mare was gone into the tree line to the north, and the expression on Caleb's face when he came back to the cabin was the first one Evelyn had seen from him that contained something recognizable as worry. She foals in 8 weeks, he said, pulling on his riding gloves. I need her found before she gets into the high country. I'll take the eastern tree line, Evelyn said immediately. He stopped. You can't. I can ride, not well, but enough. Give me the gray. The gray is... He's calm. I know. I've been working with him for 3 mornings. She met his eyes. Caleb, you go north, I go east. We cover twice the ground. It was the first time she had used his given name. She hadn't planned it. It simply came out, the word falling between them, with a weight that neither of them had quite expected. He didn't correct her. He brought out the gray and helped her mount with the brief, impersonal competence of a man helping someone accomplish a task, nothing more. He told her what signs to watch for hoof marks in the soft earth near the creek. The particular way the mare moved through underbrush, the sound she made when she was nervous. Stay on the lower ground, he said, already moving northward. Don't go past the second ridge. I know, Evelyn said. You don't know, he said, but not unkindly. She found the mare 2 hours later standing in a small clearing near the eastern creek bend, drinking with the calm indifference of an animal who had simply decided she wanted a change of scenery. Evelyn walked the gray up slowly, speaking in a low, steady voice, the same voice she had used for years with children who were afraid, and the mare lifted her head and watched her approach without alarm. She got the lead rope on her without incident. She was back at the ranch by mid-morning. When Caleb rode back in from the north an hour later and saw the mare in the paddock freshly watered and calm, he stopped his horse at the gate. He looked at the mare. He looked at Evelyn, who was mending the broken section of fence. Again. Correctly this time. He got down from his horse and walked over. You found her, he said. She found herself, Evelyn said. She was just drinking. Caleb stood beside her at the fence. He watched her work for a moment. The angle's right this time, he said. I know. He was quiet for a while. Then, I'm not a man who says thank you easily. I've noticed. But? A pause. Long enough that she looked up. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the mare, at the mountain beyond, at something in the middle distance that didn't exist in the physical world. I see what you're doing. I want you to know that. Evelyn looked back down at the fence post. What am I doing? Another pause. Trying, he said. Every day, without being asked. It was not a declaration. It was not a softening. It was a man who had built walls so high he had forgotten there were things worth looking at beyond them, and he was acknowledging, in the only way he knew how, that he had looked. That's all any of us can do, Evelyn said. Caleb picked up the other end of the fence rail and held it in place while she drove the nail. They worked like that until the fence was done. Neither of them spoke again. Neither of them needed to. The 7th day came and passed. Caleb didn't mention the 1-week deadline. Evelyn didn't ask. She woke up on the 8th morning, built the fire, put the coffee on, and went to find the eggs. When Caleb came out and sat down at the table, he picked up his coffee cup and opened his ledger. After a moment, without looking up, he said, East fence on the lower pasture needs checking. I'll go after breakfast, Evelyn said. Take the gray. All right. He turned a page in the ledger. She put his eggs in front of him. Outside, the summer morning opened up over the Montana mountains in all its enormous, indifferent beauty. And inside the cabin, in the space between two people who had both lost too much and survived it anyway, something too fragile to name, was beginning slowly and quietly to take root. The 8th morning became the 9th, and the 9th became the 10th. And somewhere in the quiet accumulation of those days, Evelyn Carter stopped counting, not because she had forgotten where she was or why she had come. She remembered everything. Pierce's letter, the stagecoach, the butcher's laugh, the 2 men with the silver watch chain who had ridden away with her words, still hanging in the summer air. She remembered all of it with the precise, unsparing clarity of a woman who had learned that forgetting things was a luxury she could not afford. She stopped counting because she had started living. That distinction mattered more than she could have explained. The days had a shape now. Fire before dawn. Coffee. Eggs or cornmeal or both depending on what the week had brought. Caleb at the table with his ledger not speaking, but no longer carrying that rigid absence that had made the first mornings feel like sharing a room with a locked door. Water from the creek, the horses, the fence line, the cattle who had slowly stopped treating her like an intruder and started treating her like furniture, which on a ranch meant they had accepted her. Late afternoon, whatever needed doing. Supper. The long summer dusk which lasted so long in Montana that it seemed to be negotiating with the night rather than simply surrendering to it. And Caleb. Always Caleb somewhere on the property, visible or audible, or simply present in the way a mountain is present as a fact of the landscape that you stopped questioning and started navigating around. He hadn't said another word about the 1-week deadline. She hadn't asked. But on the morning of the 11th day, something shifted. Evelyn was at the creek filling the morning water buckets when she heard him behind her. She had learned his footsteps, heavier on the right, from an old injury. He never mentioned deliberately quiet in a way that suggested a man who had once needed to move without being heard. She didn't turn around. "You've been doing the creek run twice a day," he said. "The barrel runs low by afternoon." "I know." A pause. "I've been meaning to dig a second cistern for 2 years. Evelyn straightened and turned to look at him. He was standing a few feet back with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim, a gesture she had come to recognize as the thing he did when he was working up to saying something he wasn't sure how to say. "I could help with that," she said. His eyes moved to her hands. Her palms had hardened over the past 10 days. Not the calluses of a lifetime, but the beginning of them, the skin thickening and toughening in the way that working hands do. He noticed. She saw him notice. "It's hard digging," he said. "I know what hard digging is now." Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile. Caleb Thornton's face didn't do smiles easily, but a loosening, a small release of the permanent tension he carried like a second skin. "You didn't 3 weeks ago." "No," Evelyn agreed. 3 weeks ago, I thought I knew what hard work was because I graded papers until midnight." She picked up her buckets. "I was wrong about a lot of things 3 weeks ago." She started back toward the cabin. After a moment, she heard him follow. "After lunch," he said from behind her. "We start on the cistern." Evelyn kept walking. "After lunch," she agreed. They started on the cistern after lunch. It took 4 days of work that left Evelyn so tired she fell asleep at the supper table on the 3rd evening. Actually asleep, head dropping toward her folded arms. And she jerked awake to find Caleb standing at the other end of the table with a coffee cup in his hand, watching her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not pity. Something more careful than that. "Go to bed," he said quietly. "It'll be there tomorrow." "I'm fine," she said automatically. "You're not," he said with the same calm certainty he used to assess fence lines and weather. "Go to bed, Evelyn." She went. She lay in the dark of the small room and stared at the ceiling and thought about the fact that he had used her given name. He had done it the same way she had used his without planning it. The name arriving before the decision to use it could intervene. She told herself it didn't mean anything. She was almost certain she was lying. The cistern was finished on the afternoon of the 15th day, and when the first water ran clean into it, Caleb stood and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at Evelyn, who was grimy and exhausted and proud, in a way that started somewhere deep in her chest where the fear used to live. "Good work," he said. 2 words. It should not have meant as much as it did. It meant more than she wanted to admit. The trouble came back on the 17th day, and this time it didn't arrive on horseback. It arrived in the form of Margaret Hale. Margaret was the wife of the man who owned the general store in Coldwater Ridge, and she was the kind of woman who had made a career out of knowing things about other people. She appeared at Caleb's gate on a Tuesday morning with a basket of bread and a smile so perfectly constructed it could have been painted on. Evelyn was the one who answered the gate. Margaret said, looking Evelyn up and down, with eyes that were doing a great deal more work than her smile. "You're still here." "Good morning," Evelyn said. "I brought bread for Caleb." Margaret held up the basket. "He hasn't come into town in a few weeks. People were wondering. He's been working." Margaret's eyes moved past Evelyn to the cabin to the yard cataloging and assessing. "Well, things look different. You've been busy." "We've been busy," Evelyn said. "Can I give him a message for you, Mrs. Hale?" The smile held. "I'll just leave the bread." She held it out over the gate. "You know people in town have been talking about the arrangement. They think, well, you know how people talk." "I know exactly how people talk," Evelyn said, taking the basket. "Thank you for the bread. They say Pierce is getting impatient." The smile didn't change, but Margaret's voice dropped half a note. "They say he expected you to be gone by now, that he has plans for this land that don't require either of you on it." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "What kind of plans?" "The railroad kind." Margaret held her gaze. "The kind that pay very well to men who own the right property at the right moment." A pause. "I'm not saying this to frighten you, Miss Carter. I'm saying it because, well, I've known Caleb Thornton for 15 years. He was a good man before the grief took the edges off him, and he'd be a good man again if someone would stand still long enough to let him be." Another pause, shorter. "I just hope you're planning to stand still." She turned and walked back down the road. Evelyn stood at the gate with the breadbasket and let Margaret Hale's words rearrange themselves in her mind. The railroad. That was what Pierce wanted. Not the land for the land railroad, for the route that would make it worth 10 times what it cost, for the kind of money that turned ordinary men into untouchable ones. Caleb's mountain property sat exactly where a northern railroad route would need to run, and Pierce had been maneuvering for it for months, probably years long before Evelyn had ever become part of his calculations. She had been sent here as a distraction, a complication. A woman Pierce believed would fail quickly and quietly, giving him the contractual leverage to move. He had miscalculated. But Evelyn now understood that he knew he had miscalculated. And men like Pierce, when they found themselves miscalculated, did not sit quietly and accept the result. She brought the bread inside and set it on the table. Caleb came in from the barn an hour later. She told him what Margaret had said. All of it. He listened without interrupting, which was simply how he listened completely, without filling the space with his own noise. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down at the table and put both hands flat on the surface. "How much do you know about railroad routes?" he asked. "Enough. I had a student whose father worked for the Union Pacific. He talked about nothing else for 2 years. She sat across from him. "If Pierce needs this land for the route, he needs it before the surveying commission comes through." "When is that?" Caleb looked at her. "How do you know about the surveying commission?" "Margaret Hale isn't the only person who talks in Coldwater Ridge," Evelyn said. "When does the commission arrive?" A pause. 6 weeks. "Then we have 6 weeks to make this property undeniable," Evelyn said. "Not just surviving, thriving, producing. Something no bank can look at and call a foreclosure candidate." Caleb stared at her across the table. "You're talking about a complete overhaul of the operation, in 6 weeks, with 2 people. We built a cistern in 4 days. That's not the same. No, it's harder, but it's the same principle." She leaned forward. "Caleb Pierce isn't going to stop sending men. He's not going to stop applying pressure. The only thing that beats a man like Pierce is making his plan look small." She met his eyes. "I know how he thinks. I fought him for 6 months and lost, but I learned him. I know exactly what he considers valuable and exactly what he considers worthless. Let me use that." Caleb was silent for a long time. Outside, the summer wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like something breathing. "Why?" he said finally. Evelyn blinked. "Why what? Why do you care what happens to this ranch? You didn't choose to come here. Pierce sent you. You could leave, find somewhere else, start again. You're smart enough." His voice was completely even. "So why are you still sitting at my table talking about my land like it's yours to protect?" The question landed in the room with unexpected weight. Evelyn sat with it for a moment. "Because this is the first place in a long time where what I do matters," she said. "In St. Louis, I built something real, and it was taken from me by a man with a pen and a signature. Here," she stopped, started again. "Here, when I fix a fence, it stays fixed. When I carry water, things get watered. When I work, the work is actually there the next morning." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not fighting for your land, Caleb. I'm fighting for the principle of something that someone worked for being worth something. That's the only thing I've ever believed in." The silence was different this time. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and whatever he was seeing in her face was something he was taking seriously. She could see that in the way his stillness had a different quality from his ordinary stillness. This one was the stillness of a man not shutting down, but opening up very carefully, 1 inch at a time. "All right," he said. "All right. Tell me what you need." Evelyn pulled a piece of paper from her pocket. She had been writing on it since that morning. He looked at the list. A long pause. "You've been planning this since breakfast," he said. "Since yesterday," she admitted. For the second time, something moved across Caleb Thornton's face that wasn't quite a smile, but was unquestionably in that direction. "Start with the south pasture," he said, and reached for the paper. The next 2 weeks were the hardest and the strangest of Evelyn's life. Harder than the first days on the ranch, which had been hard in the way that pure physical shock is hard, sudden, and total. This hardness was different. This was sustained and intelligent, and required her to be 2 things at once: the woman doing the physical work, and the woman thinking 3 steps ahead of a man who had more money and more power than either of them. She wrote letters. That was the part Caleb hadn't expected. On the 3rd evening of their new arrangement, he came in from the south pasture to find her at the table with paper and ink and a methodical, focused expression that reminded him of something he couldn't quite name. "Who are you writing to?" he asked. "The county land office," she said without looking up. "And Judge Whitmore's clerk in Helena. And a man named Harold Dietz, who used to work for the Great Northern Railway surveying team, and who owes me a considerable favor." Caleb put down his hat. "How do you know a railroad surveyor? His daughter was in my school for 3 years, best student I ever had." She folded the first letter. "He'll tell me where the commission is actually surveying, not where Pierce wants people to think they're surveying. There's a difference." Caleb sat down slowly. "You're building a case. I'm building documentation." She looked up. "There's a difference. A case implies we're going to court. Documentation means that when Pierce makes his next move, we have an answer already written." She pushed a second sheet of paper across the table. "I need you to sign this." He looked at it. "This is a property declaration. With witnesses," Evelyn said. 2 signatures filed with the county clerk before Pierce can file anything. It establishes continuous occupancy and active ranch operation as of this date." She met his eyes. "He can't foreclose on an actively operating property with clean documentation. He needs a legal gap. We're closing the gap." Caleb picked up the pen. He signed. She took the paper back with the efficiency of a woman who had learned the hard way that signed papers needed to leave the room before anyone reconsidered. "You really fought him for 6 months," Caleb said. "I really did. What did he take from you?" A pause. Evelyn set down the pen. She didn't look at him, but she didn't look away from him either. She looked at the middle ground, the space between them that had been shrinking day by day without anyone deciding it should. "A school," she said. "I built it myself, raised the money, hired the teachers, bought the books, 3 years of work. It was the first thing I ever made that was completely mine. She was quiet for a moment. Pierce called in a loan that I didn't know I had. A co-signer had borrowed against the school's property deed without telling me. When he disappeared, the debt was mine. And the courts decided a woman couldn't be the sole owner of a property with outstanding debt and no male co-signer. She finally looked at him. That's the law, Caleb. That's just the law. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. It wasn't pity she was grateful for, that she had had enough of pity. It was something quieter and more personal. Recognition, maybe. The look of one person seeing for the first time the specific shape of another person's loss. I lost something too, he said. She waited. He didn't say anything else for a long moment. Then slowly, like a man pulling something heavy from a long way down. My wife, 7 years ago, and my son. He was 4 months old. The room was very still. Caleb, Evelyn said quietly. Fever, he said. Both of them, same week. He picked up his coffee cup, realized it was empty, set it back down. I built this ranch for them. Every post, every beam. I had plans. He stopped. Doesn't matter now what the plans were. It matters, Evelyn said. It doesn't change anything. No, she agreed. But it matters anyway. He stood up from the table and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, and she understood that this was as far as he was going tonight, as far as this man had probably gone with another person in 7 years. She didn't push. I'm going to check the south pasture gate, he said. I'll have supper ready when you're back. He took his hat from the peg by the door. At the threshold, without turning around, he said, her name was Clara. He went out. Evelyn sat at the table for a long time after that, the letters in front of her, and the evening coming through the window, and the mountain pressing its enormous silence against everything. She understood now why the ranch felt like a memorial. She understood why a man who had built something for someone he loved would fight for it with such complete, quiet ferocity. She sealed the letters and set them by the door for the morning post. Harold Dietz's reply came 11 days later. Evelyn read it twice, standing at the gate, then carried it inside and spread it on the table, and read it a third time before she called for Caleb. He came in from the barn, reading her face before he read the letter. What is it? The surveying commission, she said. Their route has changed. Changed how? She put her finger on the relevant paragraph. He leaned over the table and read it. His jaw went tight. That's not the northern route, he said. That's the valley route. That goes through the lowland parcels, Evelyn said. Not the mountain property. She looked at him. Caleb Pierce's entire plan was based on the northern route. If the commission has moved to the valley, then the mountain land is worthless to him. Not worthless. Less valuable. Significantly less valuable. She straightened. He's been lying. To his investors, to his clients, probably to the bank board. If the route doesn't come through your property, all of his positioning here, the loan, the contract, the pressure, it's built on false projections. Caleb was silent, reading the letter again. This needs to get to someone, he said. I know who, Evelyn said. I've been writing to Judge Whitmore's office for 2 weeks. Harold Dietz will testify to the commission's route change. I have copies of the original land valuations Pierce submitted to the bank board, copies that still list your property at the inflated value based on the northern route. She paused. If we can get those documents to Whitmore's circuit hearing next month, he'd have to answer for the fraud. In front of a federal judge, yes. Caleb put the letter down. He turned to look at her fully, directly, in the way he rarely did. The way that made her feel seen in a manner she found both necessary and slightly terrifying. How long have you been building this? He asked. Since the day Margaret Hale told me about the railroad, Evelyn said. 17 days. A long pause. Evelyn. I know it's a lot to, Evelyn. He said her name differently this time, not as punctuation, not as a door closing, as a word that meant something by itself, something that needed no sentence around it. She stopped talking. He looked at her for a moment with something on his face that she was trying hard not to interpret, because she had learned from experience that interpreting things too quickly got a person into trouble, and she had enough trouble already. "You rode through hell," he said finally, "to get to a mountain nobody wanted you on." "Yes." "And you've been fighting for it since the day you arrived." "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me what you were building?" "Because," Evelyn said carefully, "you needed to trust me first. And trust doesn't come from being told about things. It comes from watching them happen." She held his gaze. "You had to watch me work before you'd believe I was working." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something she had not once seen him do in 28 days on his ranch. He sat down at the table across from her, folded his hands and said, "Tell me everything. All of it. Everything you've written and everything you're planning. I want to know all of it." Evelyn sat down. She told him everything. They talked until the fire burned low, and the summer dark settled fully over the mountain, and outside the cattle shifted, and the horses moved in their paddock, and the Montana night did what Montana nights do, stretched out enormous and star-thick, and indifferent to everything that was small and human and afraid. But inside the cabin, something was happening that had nothing to do with fear. It had to do with two people, both of whom had survived terrible things alone, sitting across a table from each other and choosing for the first time in a very long time not to be alone. 3 days after the letter from Harold Dietz Pierce made his move. Not with his men this time. Not with contracts or horses or silver watch chains. He made it the way he always made his most effective moves through the community. Through the invisible architecture of a small town's opinion. Evelyn found out about it on a Thursday when she rode the gray into Coldwater Ridge for supplies. She had been doing the supply runs for 2 weeks. Not because Caleb couldn't, but because she had a reason to go into town that he didn't. She was building a picture visit by visit of who in Coldwater Ridge Pierce actually controlled, and who he simply scared. There was a difference. Scared people could be turned. Controlled people were harder. She was at the counter in Henderson's general store when she heard it. 2 women at the back of the store, voices just loud enough to carry deliberately. She understood about the situation up at Thornton's ranch. About Miss Carter. About how it was a shame, really, that a man like Caleb, who had enough grief in his life, was now saddled with a woman of questionable character. A woman who'd lost her last position under unclear circumstances. A woman who... Well, nobody was saying exactly what they were saying, but the implication was unmistakable. Evelyn stood at the counter and felt the heat move up the back of her neck. She turned around. The 2 women stopped talking. "I can hear you," Evelyn said. Her voice was completely steady. She had practiced this, not this specific moment, but the principle of this moment. The practice of staying level when every instinct wanted to crack. "I imagine that's why you were speaking at that volume." The women exchanged a glance. "I know what you were just," Evelyn said. "You were repeating what Walter Pierce told someone to tell you. That's how that works. He doesn't say it himself. He never says it himself. He just makes sure it travels." She took a step forward. "You don't know anything about me. You've never spoken to me. You heard something from someone who has excellent reasons to want me discredited and no reasons to be honest about why." She looked at both women evenly. "If you'd like to know the truth about what's happening at the Thornton Ranch, I'm happy to tell you. Directly. Woman to woman, no Pierce in the middle." A long silence. One of the women, younger with the look of someone who was not entirely comfortable with what she'd been doing, said very quietly, "What is happening up there?" Evelyn told her. "Not everything. Not the documents or Harold Dietz or the surveying commission. But enough about what Pierce had done to the school in St. Louis, about how the contract worked, about what Caleb Thornton had built on that mountain, and what was being done to threaten it." By the time she finished, Mr. Henderson at the counter was pretending to organize flour sacks while listening to every word, and a man who had come in for tobacco had stopped pretending to read a posted notice and turned around to listen openly. Evelyn paid for her supplies. She loaded them on the gray. She rode back up the mountain. And behind her, in the small, shifting social ecosystem of Coldwater Ridge, something began to tilt. Not enough. Not yet. but enough to matter.
Matau.
Caleb knew something had happened the moment she came through the gate. He didn't ask. He unhitched the gray and helped her bring the supplies in, and waited, because he had learned her the way she had learned him, in the details, in the texture of ordinary things. When she told him, he was quiet for a long moment. "Pierce is getting nervous," he said. "He's getting precise," Evelyn corrected. "Nervous men get sloppy. Precise men get dangerous." She unpacked the supplies onto the shelves. "He's decided that if he can't break the property, he'll break the reputation. Ours." "He can try," Caleb said. "He's already trying." She turned. "Caleb, it's going to get worse before it gets better. You need to be ready for that." He was looking at her with an expression she was becoming more familiar with, the one where something was happening behind his eyes that his face hadn't quite caught up to yet. "Are you?" he asked. "Am I what? Ready for it to get worse?" She thought about St. Louis, about the court hearings, about 6 months of being told in various legal and social registers that she didn't matter, that what she'd built didn't count, that the rules were the rules, and the rules weren't made for women like her. She thought about the morning she had arrived at Caleb's gate with 14 cents and a trunk that held everything she owned. She thought about the cistern, the fence posts, Clara's name spoken in the firelight. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." Caleb nodded once. "Then let's get supper started." He picked up the flour from the counter and handed it to her. Their hands touched for one brief moment at the transfer, nothing deliberate, nothing planned, the ordinary accident of two people passing things in a small kitchen. Neither of them moved away quickly. Evelyn set the flour on the shelf. She started supper. Outside, the summer evening came down gold and enormous over the Montana mountains. And somewhere out there, Walter Pierce was making his calculations, building his next move, certain that two people on a mountain were running out of time. He was wrong about the time. What he didn't understand, what he had never understood, was that you cannot exhaust people who have already survived losing everything. You can only miscalculate how much they have left to fight with. And Evelyn Carter had considerably more than Walter Pierce had ever bothered to find out. The letter from Judge Whitmore's office arrived on a Monday. Evelyn had been waiting for it with the particular patience of someone who had learned that waiting was not passive. It was a skill, a discipline, the practice of continuing to work while your hands wanted to shake. She had filed everything 3 weeks ago. The property declaration, the documented land valuations, the copy of Harold Dietz's testimony about the Surveying Commission's route change. She had written the cover letter herself, 4 drafts, each one sharper than the last, until she had something that was precise and undeniable and gave Judge Whitmore's clerk no reason to set it aside. She had worked on those letters at the table while Caleb slept. She had not told him she was doing it at midnight because she knew he would tell her to rest, and she could not rest. Not yet. Not while Pierce was still making calculations. So when Holt's son, not Holt himself, who still worked for Pierce, but the boy, maybe 14, who rode the mail route on a spotted pony, came up the road and handed her the envelope. Her hands were steady. She had made them be. She read it standing at the gate. Then she read it again. Then she walked into the barn where Caleb was working on a harness that had cracked at the buckle, and she held the letter out without saying anything. He took it. He read it. His hands went still on the harness. "Helena," he said. "Next month, the circuit hearing." Evelyn's voice was controlled. "Whitmore is requesting Pierce's full financial documentation on the northern route projections. That means the bank board records, the investor presentations, everything." She paused. "Harold Dietz has been subpoenaed to testify." Caleb set the harness down. He looked at her. "You did this," he said. "We did this. Your signature is on half those documents. Evelyn." His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not the careful, contained tone he used for most things, but something raw. Something that had been sitting underneath the control for a long time. "You came here with nothing, and you built a federal case in 6 weeks." "I built a filing," she corrected. "It becomes a case when Whitmore decides it does." "That's not—" He stopped, started again. "That's not what I mean." She looked at him. He was looking at her in the way he had been looking at her more often lately, the way where she could see him deciding something, the slow, deliberate decision-making of a man who had stopped making decisions about people years ago and was remembering cautiously and with visible effort how it was done. "I know what you mean," she said quietly. A moment between them, the kind of moment that has weight that you feel afterward in the space where it was. Then Caleb picked up the harness. "I'll ride into town this afternoon," he said. "Tell Henderson what's coming. Man's been on the fence about Pierce for 2 years. He needs to know which way it's falling." "Take the letter," Evelyn said. He took the letter. She went back to the cabin and let herself sit down for exactly 5 minutes, both hands flat on the table, and breathe. Then she got up and started on the afternoon work. Pierce found out by Wednesday. Evelyn didn't know how she had been careful. Caleb had been careful, but Pierce had been reading this town like a ledger for 15 years, and very little happened in Coldwater Ridge that he didn't know about before it finished happening. She found out that he knew when the man with the silver watch chain appeared at the gate again, and this time he didn't come with a companion. He came with 4 men. Evelyn was in the yard when they rode up. Caleb was on the south pasture. She was alone. She walked to the gate and did not open it. The man with the watch chain looked different today. The loose, easy confidence from his first visit was still there, but there was something underneath it now, something tighter. Pierce was nervous, she had told Caleb. Men who were nervous sent more people. "Miss Carter," the man said. "We need to speak with Thornton." "He's working," she said. "You can leave a message." "This isn't a message kind of conversation." "Then you'll need to come back." One of the 4 men heavy-set positioned just to the right of the gate shifted his horse forward half a step. It was the kind of move that was meant to be noticed, and she noticed it. "Mr. Pierce," the watch chain man said, "is prepared to offer a resolution. He's willing to forgive the outstanding loan entirely, in exchange for the property deed signed today and Miss Carter on the first stage out of here tomorrow morning." Evelyn looked at him steadily. The outstanding loan that was built on fraudulent land valuations. The man's expression flickered. "I don't know what you think you've—" "The Surveying Commission changed their route 6 weeks ago," Evelyn said. "The northern route that Pierce used to inflate this property's value to his investors and to the bank board doesn't exist anymore. The documentation of that fact is currently sitting in Judge Whitmore's office in Helena." She paused. "So, when you talk about a resolution, I want to be clear about what resolution is actually available here." Dead silence from all 5 men. Then, the watch chain man's voice went flat. "You're making a serious mistake." "I'm correcting one," Evelyn said. "Mr. Pierce made the original." The heavy-set man said something under his breath. The watch chain man cut a look at him sharp, quick, and he went quiet. "Thornton should hear this offer himself," the watch chain man said. "I'll tell him," Evelyn said. "He'll say no, but I'll tell him." A long pause. The 5 men looked at her, and she looked back, and the gate between them was both entirely physical and entirely insufficient, and she knew that, and so did they. "Tomorrow," the watch chain man said finally. "We'll be back tomorrow. Make sure Thornton is here." They rode away. Evelyn stood at the gate until they were out of sight. Then she turned and walked to the south pasture, and she walked fast. Caleb's reaction was not what she expected. She expected anger, the controlled, purposeful kind she had seen from him before, the kind that went somewhere useful. What she got instead was a stillness so complete it felt like the air around him had changed temperature. He listened to everything she said without moving. Then he said, "They'll come back tonight." "They said tomorrow." "They said tomorrow, so you'd be watching for tomorrow." He was already moving, scanning the property with the systematic attention of a man who had been reading threat in landscapes for years. Pierce didn't drive 4 men up here in the middle of a Wednesday to make an offer. That offer was a warning. He wanted to know if we'd fold. "We won't." He knows that now. Caleb's jaw was tight. Which means tonight. She stared at him. Caleb, I've seen this before, not Pierce, but men like him. He looked at her directly. When legal pressure fails, they don't wait. They move fast, because fast doesn't leave documentation. What do? A pause. The kind of pause that had a specific shape. Whatever looks like an accident, he said. The word accident hung in the summer air between them. Evelyn thought about the south pasture fence, the cistern, the mare's paddock, the barn full of summer dry hay sitting 30 feet from the cabin. The barn, she said. His eyes said yes before he did. We moved the horses out tonight, he said. Cattle to the north pasture, they're already half there, and we don't sleep. All right, you don't have to stay for this part, he said. Not unkindly, not dismissively. The way you say something you believe and know the other person won't accept. Town would be safer. Evelyn looked at him. Is that what you want? For me to go to town? He held her gaze. No, he said quietly. It's not. Then stop suggesting it. He turned back to the barn. Horses first. Move. They moved. By full dark, the horses were in the north paddock behind the tree line, and the cattle were spread across the upper pasture, and the barn stood empty in the summer night, which meant that what it held now was only dry timber and an open door, and the possibility that Pierce's men had made the same calculation Caleb had. They didn't wait inside the cabin. Caleb was in the shadows near the eastern fence line, which gave him a clear view of the road and the barn. Evelyn was at the corner of the cabin, his instruction her negotiation, because he had wanted her inside, and she had refused with a directness that surprised even her. If I'm inside, I can't hear what's happening, she'd said. That's the point, he'd said. Caleb. She had said his name the way she was learning to say it with the full weight of what it carried between them. I am not going to be the person who hid while you defended what we built. I am not that person. He had looked at her for a long moment. East corner, he'd said. You don't move from it. East corner, she'd agreed. Now she stood at the east corner of the cabin and listened to the mountain night and tried to slow her heartbeat by counting her own breaths, which didn't work, but gave her hands something to do. She heard them before she saw them. 3 horses, slow, no lanterns. Pierce's men were smarter than that, or careful, which was worse. They came up from the south off the road through the tree line, moving in the way that men move when they're trying to be quiet, but have decided that speed matters more. 2 of them went to the barn. The 3rd stayed with the horses on the tree line. Evelyn watched the barn door. She watched the darkness inside it. She counted seconds. And then Caleb's voice came out of the eastern shadows, low and absolutely clear. I know you're there, both of you. Step out of the barn. Dead silence. Then one of the men's voices. Thornton. Step out of the barn, Caleb said again. With your hands where I can see them. I won't say it a 3rd time. A long moment that lasted years. Then both men came out of the barn. They were younger than she expected. Not the watch chain man, neither of them just men doing what they'd been paid to do, and now standing in the yard of a ranch they'd come to burn with a mountain cowboy somewhere in the dark, and no certainty of where exactly he was. What were you doing in my barn? Caleb said. One of them, the taller one, said nothing. The other one, younger, said, Pierce just wants the property. I know what Pierce wants. Caleb stepped out of the shadows. He was carrying his rifle at his side, not raised, but present. Pierce wants something that belongs to me, and he sent you to take it in a way that would look like an accident. He walked toward them steadily. You are going to get back on your horses. You are going to ride back to Coldwater Ridge. And you are going to tell Walter Pierce that the next time he sends someone to my property in the dark, I will have the county sheriff at his bank door before sunrise. The younger man's eyes moved to Evelyn. She saw the moment he registered her standing at the corner of the cabin, not hidden, not cowering. He looked back at Caleb. "He's not going to stop," the young man said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't defiance. It was almost warning. "He's too far in. He told the bank board this land was worth 3 times what it is. If the circuit hearing proves that out, he loses everything. That," Caleb said, "is his problem. He'll make it yours." "He's been trying." Caleb stopped 10 feet from them. "Tell him we're ready." The two men exchanged a look. They walked back to the tree line. A minute later, 3 horses moved south through the dark, and then they were gone, and the Montana night closed back over the ranch like water closing over a stone. Evelyn walked across the yard to where Caleb stood. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "You knew they were there before I did," she said. "I heard them on the south road 20 minutes ago." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you would have done something." A pause. "Something brave and inadvisable." She almost smiled. "You don't know that." "Evelyn," he said with a patience so warm it caught her off guard. "I know exactly that." They stood in the yard together in the dark, and the tension of the last hours was draining out of her body slowly like water from a cracked vessel, leaving behind something shaky and raw. "He's not going to stop," she said, the young man's voice still in her ears. "No," Caleb said. "He's not. So what do we do?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then, we give him nothing left to take." 3 days later, the fire started. Not the barn. Not the cabin. The south pasture, the long grass at the far end that had been drying in 6 weeks of summer heat, and it started at 3 in the morning, and the wind was from the wrong direction entirely. Evelyn smelled it in her sleep. She was out of the cot and through the cabin door before she was fully awake, and the sky to the south was already orange at the base where it should have been black, and the wind was carrying the fire's sound, a low, continuous roar, the sound of something that had found what it was looking for. She hammered on Caleb's door. He came out in seconds. He took one look at the southern sky and said one word very quietly that she had never heard him use before. Then he was moving. "Creek buckets. Every one we have." He was already pulling on his boots, his coat, his gloves. "Wet the fence line on the east pasture. If it crosses that fence, it takes the hayfield with it." "The cattle." "Already north. Go." She went. The next 2 hours were the worst of her life, and she had had some bad hours to compare them to. The fire moved. The way fire always moves, with complete indifference to anything that mattered, taking what was in front of it, and deciding about the rest as it went. Evelyn ran the creek to the east fence line, and back again and again, until her arm stopped registering the weight of the buckets, until the only thing that existed was the next trip, and the one after that. She could hear Caleb to the south, his voice, his movement, the sound of a man doing the work of 3 men, because there were only 2 of them. He had ridden to the edge of the burn line with the full water barrel lashed to the saddle, and he was fighting the fire at its eastern flank, trying to cut it off before it reached the hayfield, and she could see his silhouette against the orange-lit sky, and then she couldn't. And the 20 seconds between seeing him and seeing him again were the worst 20 seconds she could remember. She kept moving. She did not let herself stop to think. The fire turned. She didn't see why at first, then she understood. The wind shifted. The mountains did that. Caleb had told her in the first week wind on the mountain can change direction in under a minute, and that was terrifying most of the time. But right now, it was the only reason the hayfield was still standing. The fire pulled south and east away from the fence line, back onto the already burned ground running out of fuel. It didn't go out, but it stopped coming. Evelyn stood at the east fence with empty buckets in both hands and watched the fire consume what it had already claimed and leave the rest alone, and she breathed and kept breathing, because the alternative was something she wasn't ready to do. Then she heard Caleb's horse. He came back from the south pasture at a hard run, and he was pulling up at the fence line 20 feet from her, and she could see in the firelight that his left arm was wrong, held differently tucked in against his side at an angle that arms weren't meant to hold. She ran to the horse. "Your arm," she said. Fence post came down on it. His voice was tight. Not panicked, Caleb Thornton didn't panic, but strained in a way she had never heard. "I don't think it's broke. Get down. The cattle are in the north pasture and fine. Get down." He got down. He was heavier than he looked, which was saying something, and the controlled way he was managing the injured arm told her it hurt more than he was admitting, which was also saying something. She pulled him toward the cabin, and he walked with her without arguing, which scared her more than anything that had happened in the last 2 hours. Inside, she put the lantern up and looked at the arm. Not broken, she had seen broken. Her father had broken his collarbone when she was 12, and she remembered the shape of it. This was muscle damage, probably a deep bruise from the impact, the kind of injury that would hurt for weeks and needed to be kept still. Caleb was not the kind of man who kept things still. "You need to rest this," she said. "Can't." "Caleb, there's fence line down in 3 places on the south pasture, and the cattle can't go back until it's up." He moved to stand. She put her hand on his right shoulder, and he stopped. Not because she could have held him. She couldn't, he had 70 pounds on her, but because her hand on his shoulder meant something, and they both understood that it meant something, and so he stayed. "Tomorrow," she said. "The fence is tomorrow. Tonight you sit down." He looked at her. In the lantern light, smoke grimed and tired with the fire dying outside and the long night behind them, Caleb Thornton looked at Evelyn Carter with something on his face that had no more control left on it. Just the thing itself. "You stayed," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Of course I stayed. I told you East Corner." "You did," she agreed. "And I stayed East Corner until you were in the dark, and I couldn't hear you anymore, and then I did what needed doing." She kept her hand on his shoulder. "That's what I'm going to keep doing. You should know that." He looked at her hand on his shoulder. He looked at her face. "Pierce set that fire," he said. "I know. We can't prove it." "Not tonight," she said. "But Harold Dietz's testimony covers more than the route change. I wrote him back last week and asked him specifically about the land assessment documentation. If Pierce made those projections knowing the route had changed," she paused. "He didn't just defraud you, he defrauded the bank board and his own investors. That's federal territory, Caleb. That's not a county matter." He absorbed this. "You wrote to Dietz again," he said. 2 weeks ago. You didn't tell me." "I was waiting to see what he said." A long pause. Outside, the fire was down to a low crackle, spending itself on what little fuel remained. "What did he say?" Evelyn reached into the pocket of her coat. She had not taken it off in all the running and carrying, and now she understood why some part of her had known she might need it and produced a folded letter. She handed it to him. He read it by the lantern. His face went very still. "He has the original assessment report," Caleb said. "Signed by Pierce's surveyor. Dated after the commission changed the route." "Dated 3 weeks after?" Evelyn said. "Which means Pierce knew the route had changed and submitted falsified projections anyway." Caleb put the letter down. He was silent for a long time. Then, "That's not fraud. That's wire fraud. Mail fraud. That's a federal crime." "Yes," Evelyn said. "It is." Another silence. "He'll know this is coming," Caleb said. "Once Whitmore's office gets Dietz's addendum, he might already know. Dietz isn't a quiet man." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "Caleb, this is why he sent those men Wednesday night. This is why the fire happened tonight. He's not trying to pressure us anymore. He's trying to destroy the evidence before the hearing." "What evidence does he think is here?" "He thinks my copies are here." She paused. "They're not." Caleb stared at her. "Where are they?" "Henderson's store. Back room. Mr. Henderson put them there himself 11 days ago, after I explained what they were." She watched his face. "He's been on the fence about Pierce for 2 years, you said. He needed to know which way it was falling." She held his gaze. "I showed him." The look on Caleb's face was the one she had been seeing more often, the one where something behind his eyes was rearranging itself, the careful process of a man updating a picture of the world that he had thought was complete. "You've been 3 moves ahead of him this whole time," Caleb said. "I've been trying to be." She finally sat down across the table. The adrenaline was leaving her body, and what was underneath it was exhaustion so profound it had its own particular quality of silence. "I'm not always sure it's enough." "It's enough." His voice was certain in a way that landed in her chest differently than she expected. She looked at him. He was looking back. And there it was, the thing that had been building between them in the space of every morning fire and creek bucket and fence post and shared supper, the thing that neither of them had named, because naming it required a kind of courage that was different from every other kind they had demonstrated. The thing that was nevertheless completely present and had been for weeks. "Caleb," she said. "I know," he said. A long moment. She reached across the table. She put her hand over his, the right one, not the injured arm, and she held it there. And he turned his hand over and held hers back, and that was all. That was enough. That was more than either of them had allowed themselves in years. "Get some sleep," she said quietly. "You too." "I will." He didn't move. She didn't move. The lantern burned between them. Outside, the fire was out. In the morning, Caleb's arm was stiff and deeply bruised, but functional, and the south pasture fence was down in 4 places, and the damage to the grass was bad, but not catastrophic. The hayfield had held, the cattle were fine, the horses were fine, the barn was standing. They stood at the edge of the burned ground and looked at what Pierce had taken. 3 acres, Caleb said. "We can reseed in fall," Evelyn said. "It'll be 2 years before it's productive. Then we plan for 2 years. He looked at her. "You keep saying we," he said. She looked back. "Does that bother you?" A pause. "No," he said. "It doesn't." They walked back to start on the fence. An hour into the work, Caleb said without looking up from the post he was setting, "There was a time when I would have told Pierce to take the land." Evelyn stopped. "When?" "After Clara." He drove the post another inch into the ground. "After the boy. There was a period, maybe 2 years, when I didn't care if any of this was here or not." He was quiet for a moment. "I stayed because leaving felt like giving up something she had cared about. Not because I cared about it myself." Evelyn watched him. "And now?" she asked. He looked up from the fence post. His eyes found hers with the directness that she had come to understand was the only way he knew how to be completely or not at all. "Now I care about it myself," he said. He went back to the fence post. Evelyn picked up the next rail. They worked in silence side by side in the long summer morning with the burned ground behind them and the mountain ahead. And somewhere to the south, Walter Pierce was running out of moves. He just didn't know it yet, but he was about to find out. The ride to Helena took 2 days. Caleb had not planned to go. That was the honest truth of it. He had planned to send Evelyn with Henderson as escort with the documents and Harold Dietz's addendum and the property declaration, all of it organized and filed and ready for Judge Whitmore's circuit hearing. He had planned to stay on the ranch because the fence still needed work and the south pasture needed assessment, and because standing in a courtroom was something that belonged to a world he had walked away from 7 years ago, when the world had proven it had very little to offer him. Evelyn had not argued with him about it. She had simply said the evening before she was scheduled to leave, "I'd like you to come." Not "you should," not "you need to," "I'd like you to." He had looked at her across the supper table, this woman who had arrived at his gate with 14 cents and a trunk, and the particular defiance of someone who had nothing left to lose, and he had understood that she was not asking him to come for the hearing. She was asking him to come because she did not want to do this alone. There was a difference. He had saddled his horse before sunrise. They rode into Coldwater Ridge together and found Henderson waiting with his wagon and his wife Martha, who had apparently decided the hearing was worth closing the store for, and had packed enough food for 4 people and 2 days, which turned out to be exactly right. Harold Dietz met them at the junction road north of town, A small, precise man with a surveyor's habit of measuring everything he looked at, who shook Evelyn's hand with the particular warmth of someone who remembered a debt clearly. "Miss Carter," he said, "your student would be proud of what you've built here." "Tell me that when it's over," Evelyn said. Dietz smiled. "Fair enough." They rode north. Caleb stayed close to Evelyn on the road, not deliberately, or not in a way he examined too carefully. But the distance between their horses was consistently smaller than the road required, and he was aware of that, and he thought she was too. On the first night camped off the road with Henderson's fire and Martha's biscuits and the enormous Montana sky pressing down on all of them, Dietz told them something new. He told them about a second surveyor. "There was a man named Garrett," Dietz said, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Junior surveyor on Pierce's crew. He was there when the route change was confirmed. He signed the original report that Pierce then altered." A pause. "Garrett left Pierce's employment 3 months ago." Quietly. Evelyn looked up. "Where is he now?" "Billings," Dietz said. "I found him 2 weeks ago. He's willing to testify." The silence around the fire had a particular quality. Caleb said, "You found him 2 weeks ago, and you're telling us now. I wanted to confirm he'd appear before I said anything." Dietz looked at him steadily. "A witness who won't show is worse than no witness. Garrett will show." Evelyn set her coffee cup down. "2 witnesses to the falsified report," she said very quietly. "Dietz and Garrett, with the original document, against Pierce's submitted projections to the bank board." She looked at Dietz. "He's finished." "He's not finished until Whitmore says he is," Dietz said. "But yes, he's in very serious trouble." Caleb stared into the fire. He thought about Clara. He thought about what it meant that a man had looked at the land where his wife was buried and calculated its value in railroad dollars and decided that value was worth more than the truth. He didn't say any of that. He put his coffee cup down and said, "Get some sleep. Long day tomorrow." Evelyn glanced at him. She saw something in his face. He could tell she had become very good at reading what he was choosing not to say. She didn't push. She said goodnight and went to her bedroll. He sat by the fire a while longer alone and let himself feel what he had been managing too carefully for too long. The morning couldn't come fast enough. Helena was larger than Coldwater Ridge, the way a river is larger than a creek. The same essential nature, different scale, different noise. Caleb had been there twice before, both times for ranch business, neither time with anyone beside him. He registered the city's difference from his mountain in his body, the way he always did, a slight tightening, a shift in how he held himself, the habitual adjustment of a man who preferred landscapes that didn't require this much negotiation. Evelyn beside him was the opposite. She sat straighter on the gray as they entered the city. Something in her activated not anxiety, the reverse of anxiety. She had grown up in cities, had built her work in them, had fought her battles in them. The courthouses and clerks' offices and the particular language of civic authority were things she knew how to speak. Caleb watched her and understood for the first time fully what she had given up when she lost her school. Not just the building or the money, the world she was built for. He thought about that for a long time as they rode to the courthouse. Judge Whitmore's circuit court occupied a building that took itself seriously, thick stone walls, high windows, the particular weight of a place where things were decided. Henderson tied the wagon. Dietz went in first to confirm the hearing schedule. Martha squeezed Evelyn's hand and said nothing, which was exactly right. Evelyn looked at the building. Then she looked at Caleb. "Ready," she said. "I'm not the one who needs to be ready," he said. "Yes, you are," she said. "You're Thornton Ranch. You're the owner of record. Everything we built goes through you today." She held his gaze. "I need you in that room, Caleb. Not as a witness, as the reason any of this matters." He looked at her for a moment. He tipped his hat. "Then let's go," he said. They went in. Walter Pierce was already in the room. Caleb had expected that. What he hadn't expected was Pierce himself, the man he had been fighting for months, the man who had sent riders in the night and set a summer fire and built a fraud on the grave of Clara's land. He had expected someone large, someone loud, someone who wore his power on the outside where it could be seen. Pierce was none of those things. He was small. 60 maybe, with the particular dry neatness of a man who had made his life's work the management of other people's money. He sat at the respondent's table with his lawyer, a man from Billings, who looked like he charged by the word, and he did not look at Caleb when Caleb walked in. He looked at Evelyn. It was a specific look. The look of a man recalculating. A man who had made an assessment and was discovering in real time that the assessment was wrong. Evelyn looked back at him with the expression of a woman who had been looked at that way before and had stopped finding it interesting. She sat down. Caleb sat beside her. Judge Whitmore entered 17 minutes later, a tall man older with the measured, deliberate movement of someone who had learned that the speed of justice was less important than its accuracy. He took his seat, reviewed the documents in front of him, and said without preamble, "We are here on the matter of First Federal Bank of Montana versus Thornton Ranch concerning outstanding loan documentation and disputed property valuations. I've reviewed the filings." He looked up. "Mr. Pierce, your attorney will begin." Pierce's lawyer stood. He was smooth. That was the word for it. Everything about the presentation was smooth. Every edge, rounded, every sharp thing filed down. The outstanding loan was legitimate. The property valuations reflected market projections at time of filing. The arrangement with Miss Carter was a standard contractual courtesy, nothing more. Thornton Ranch was in arrears. The bank had every legal right to Judge Whitmore, Evelyn said. Pierce's lawyer stopped. Whitmore looked at Evelyn. She was not supposed to speak. She was not the named party. She was not listed as legal representative. She knew this. She said it anyway with the calm certainty of a woman who had decided the rule was less important than the moment. "I apologize for the interruption. I would ask that before the bank's case is completed, the court consider entering into evidence the documents filed by our office last month, specifically Exhibit 3, which is the original route assessment signed by Mr. Pierce's surveying crew." Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. Pierce's lawyer said, "Your Honor, this woman has no standing." "I'll decide standing," Whitmore said without heat. He looked at Evelyn. "You are Evelyn Carter." "Your Honor, I've been residing at Thornton Ranch for the past 2 months. I prepared the filings in this matter." A pause. Whitmore looked at the documents in front of him. "You prepared these?" "Yes, Your Honor." He looked at her over his reading glasses with the expression of a man updating his picture of the room. "Mr. Thornton," Caleb said, "everything she filed has my full authorization, Judge. Every document, every letter. I'd ask the court to hear her out." Whitmore nodded once. "Proceed, Miss Carter." Pierce's lawyer sat down with the look of a man who had just been handed a problem he hadn't budgeted for. Pierce himself for the first time looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply held the eye contact with the steady, complete attention of a man who had nothing to hide and no interest in pretending otherwise. And after a moment, Pierce looked away. Evelyn began. She was extraordinary. Caleb had known she was capable. He had watched her for 2 months, had watched her fix fences and manage cattle and write letters at midnight and face down 5 men at a gate with nothing but the truth and the willingness to say it. He knew what she was made of. But watching her in that room was a different thing. She was precise. She was organized. She moved through the documentation with the systematic patience of someone who had been teaching people how to understand complex things for years and knew exactly how to sequence information so it landed where it needed to land. The original route assessment signed by Dietz and countersigned by the surveyor Garrett. The date of the commission's route change. The date of Pierce's subsequent submission to the bank board using land values derived from the original route. The gap between those 2 dates, 19 days during which Pierce had known the route had changed and had submitted projections anyway. Dietz testified. Then Garrett, who had traveled from Billings on his own expense, with the particular resolve of a man who had been carrying something for 3 months and was ready to put it down, testified to the specific moment Pierce had instructed him to omit the route change from the final report. Pierce's lawyer objected 4 times. Whitmore overruled him 4 times. Caleb sat in that room and watched Walter Pierce get smaller. Not physically, the man didn't change. But something about how he occupied the space contracted degree by degree as Evelyn and Dietz and Garrett laid out what he had done in language so clear and documented that there was nowhere to go. No edge to grab. No version of the truth that could be smoothed over. At one point, Pierce leaned to his lawyer and said something in a low voice. His lawyer shook his head. Pierce said it again. His lawyer put a hand on Pierce's arm gently, in the way you stop someone from doing something that will make things worse. Pierce sat back. Caleb noted that. Then Whitmore said, "Mr. Pierce, I'd like to hear from you directly." Pierce stood. He was more composed than Caleb expected. The man had decades of practice that was clear, decades of sitting in rooms where things didn't go his way, and finding the angle, finding the language, finding the pivot that bought him another day. "Your Honor," Pierce said, "I regret any confusion in the documentation. Markets shift. Projections are estimates. I acted in good faith on the information available to me at the time of filing." "The information available to you," Whitmore said, "included a signed route change confirmation dated 19 days before your submission. Are you saying you were unaware of that document?" A pause. "My office manages a great many documents," Pierce said. "That is not an answer to my question, Mr. Pierce." Another pause, shorter. "I may not have reviewed every document personally before the submission," Pierce said. Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. "I see," Whitmore said. Those 2 words did more damage than anything else that had been said in the room. The recess lasted 40 minutes. Caleb and Evelyn stood in the corridor outside the courtroom with Henderson and Martha and Dietz, and nobody said very much because there was nothing useful to say. Evelyn had her arms folded across her chest, and she was looking at the floor, with the focused inward expression of someone going back through every choice they'd made and checking for gaps. "You were right," Caleb said. She looked up. "About what?" "Everything." He said it simply because it was simple. "You said to give him nothing left to take. You did that." "Whitmore hasn't ruled yet," she said. "No." He paused. "But Pierce just told a federal judge he doesn't personally review his own documents. That's not a man who's going to walk away from this with a foreclosure order." Evelyn looked at him. "You sounded like a lawyer just now." "I've had a good teacher," he said. Something moved across her face, quick warm, the expression of a woman who was not accustomed to being seen clearly and was still learning what to do when it happened. She looked back at the floor. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. He waited. Before the hearing, before all of this, Pierce's lawyer contacted Henderson. She didn't look up. 3 days ago, he offered Henderson a significant amount to withdraw the documents from the back room, to say he'd stored them without knowing what they were and couldn't vouch for their authenticity. Caleb went very still. "Henderson told me the same day," Evelyn said. "He turned it down immediately. But I should have told you." She looked up. "I didn't because I didn't want to give you one more thing to worry about before the hearing, and I made a decision that was yours to make too. I'm sorry." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "Henderson turned it down," he said. "Immediately. Didn't hesitate." He nodded slowly. "Then the decision didn't need me." "Caleb, Evelyn." He said her name with a patience that was also a reassurance. "You've been managing 15 things at once for 2 months. You made a judgment call. It was right." He held her gaze. "But tell me next time." "Next time," she agreed. A pause. "What you said in there," he said. "When you spoke without being recognized. You knew you weren't supposed to." "Yes." "You did it anyway." "Yes." "That could have ended badly." "It could have." She looked at him steadily. But Whitmore was about to let Pierce's lawyer set the frame for the whole hearing, and once that frame was set, it was going to be very hard to break. "I had maybe 30 seconds. She paused. "I used them." Caleb studied her face. He thought about the gate. The first day. The woman who had stood in the road and said, "I finally found where I belong," before she had any reason to believe it was true. "I know," he said quietly. "I know you did." Martha appeared at the end of the corridor. "They're going back in," she said. Whitmore's ruling took 11 minutes. Caleb counted. The fraudulent land valuations submitted to the First Federal Bank Board were referred for federal investigation. The outstanding loan against Thornton Ranch predicated on those valuations was suspended, pending the outcome of that investigation. Walter Pierce was ordered to surrender his financial documentation to the court's appointed examiner within 30 days. His attorney immediately filed for extension, which Whitmore granted for 2 weeks and no more. The foreclosure action against Thornton Ranch was dismissed. The room was not dramatic about it. Whitmore read the ruling in the same measured voice he had used for everything else, and his clerk recorded it, and Pierce's lawyer wrote something on his notepad, and Pierce himself sat very still with his hands flat on the table. Caleb heard the words and felt them land one by one, like something being placed back in a space that had been emptied. Beside him, Evelyn exhaled, not loudly, not dramatically. Just a long, slow release, barely audible, the sound of someone who had been holding their breath for months, finally deciding it was safe to breathe again. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the table. She turned her hand over and held his. Neither of them looked at each other. They didn't need to. After Whitmore left the bench, after the room began to empty, with the shuffling movement of people who had witnessed something and needed to process it, Pierce's lawyer gathered his papers. Pierce sat for another moment. Then he stood. He looked across the room at Caleb. "This isn't what you think it is," Pierce said. His voice was controlled. Tired under the control, but controlled. "The investigation will take years. The bank board will manage it. This..." He gestured vaguely at the room, the ruling, everything. "This is a delay." Caleb stood. He was half a foot taller than Pierce, and when he crossed the room, Pierce didn't move back, which Caleb gave him credit for. "It's not a delay," Caleb said. "It's documentation. And once something is documented, Mr. Pierce, it doesn't undocument." He looked at the man evenly. "You should have left my mountain alone." Pierce looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up his hat and walked out. Caleb stood where he was for a moment in the emptying room, in the particular silence of a thing that was finished. Then he turned back. Evelyn was standing where he'd left her, watching him with Henderson's hand on her shoulder, and Martha already producing food from somewhere, and Dietz shaking his head with a small satisfied expression. Caleb walked back. When he reached her, he stopped. He had spent 7 years learning to not say things, learning to swallow what needed to be said and convert it into work, into fence posts and cattle counts and early mornings at the creek. He was good at that. He had made it into a practice so complete it had started to feel like identity. But she was standing there, and she had ridden into a federal courtroom with documents she had assembled by lantern light at midnight, and she had spoken without permission, and she had held her ground against a man who had taken everything from her once before, and she was standing there looking at him with an expression that was trying very hard to be composed, and was not quite succeeding. He said, "Come on. Henderson's wife has been feeding us for 2 days. We owe her a meal." Evelyn laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. Really laugh unguarded and full and unplanned, and it did something to the inside of his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. She walked beside him out of the courthouse. Into the Helena afternoon, the summer sun still long and gold, the mountains visible from the city streets, if you knew where to look. "Caleb," she said. What happens now?" He glanced at her. "Now," he said, "we go home." The word landed between them. Home. Not the ranch, not Thornton's place, not the property. Home. She didn't say anything. She walked beside him. But her shoulder was close enough to his that their arms touched with every other step, and neither of them moved away, and the distance between them that had been closing for 2 months, that had been measured in fence posts and creek buckets and letters written at midnight, and a hand held at a table on a night when the fire was out and the danger was past, That distance was something she could have covered with one more step. She knew it. He knew it. They walked to Henderson's wagon, and the mountain was waiting for them, north of everything large and wild and theirs. They were 2 hours north of Helena when Evelyn said, "I want to rebuild the south pasture." Caleb glanced at her. They were riding side by side on the road, Henderson's wagon ahead Dietz, having parted ways at the junction with a handshake and a promise to send Garrett's formal deposition once it was notarized. "It'll take until fall to seed it properly," he said. "I know, but if we start the reseed this week, the grass has a chance before the frost." "You've been thinking about this since the fire," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I've been thinking about it since I saw how much hay that pasture can produce when it's healthy." She looked straight ahead. "You said it yourself 2 years before it's productive. That's 2 years of buying feed you shouldn't need to buy. If we address the soil now, Evelyn." He said her name with the patience that was also warmth, the tone she had come to know as distinctly his. "We can talk about the pasture when we get back. I'm talking about it now because it helps me not think about everything else." A pause. "Everything else like what?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Like what comes next," she said. "The investigation will take months. Pierce will appeal, probably. The bank board will be slow." She glanced at him. "Nothing is actually settled." "The ranch is settled," Caleb said. "The foreclosure is dismissed. The land is ours." She registered the word ours the same way she had registered home. She chose not to examine it directly the way you choose not to look directly at a light that is still very bright. "I mean for me," she said. "What comes next for me?" Caleb rode in silence for a moment. "What do you want to come next?" he asked. She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead, but he was listening in the complete directional way that was entirely his, every part of him attending even the parts that appeared to be elsewhere. "I want to stay," she said. "That's the honest answer." He didn't respond immediately. The road wound north through the summer afternoon, and the mountain ahead was growing larger with each mile, that enormous familiar presence that had terrified her when she arrived and had become somewhere in the past 2 months the thing she looked for when she looked up. "Good," Caleb said finally. That was all. One word said quietly into the summer afternoon. Good. She looked at the road ahead. She was smiling, and she didn't try to stop. The mountain grew larger with every mile, reaching for them as much as they were reaching for it. And home, the word, the fact, the impossible ordinary miracle of it, was close enough now that she could feel it. They came home on a Thursday. Evelyn knew it was Thursday because Martha Henderson had told her twice that Thursday was the best day to plant anything you wanted to take root. Something Martha's grandmother had believed and Martha had adopted, without questioning the way people adopt the beliefs of women they love. Evelyn had not been a superstitious person before Montana. She was becoming one slowly, in the way the mountain was changing other things about her quietly, without announcement, until one day she noticed the change had already happened. The ranch looked different when they rode through the gate. It looked like theirs. She registered that without ceremony, the way you register a truth that has been building for a long time and finally reaches the surface. The cistern they had dug together. The fence line on the east pasture angled correctly this time. The south pasture burned and bare, but already beginning already in 3 weeks, showing the first thin determination of new grass at the edges. The kind of growth that isn't impressive yet, but has every intention of being impressive eventually. Caleb unsaddled the horses. She started on supper. They moved around each other in the cabin with the particular ease of two people who had been in the same space long enough that the space had reorganized itself around both of them. His things and her things, occupying the same shelves, the same kitchen, the same table where they had talked until midnight and drafted letters and eaten every meal for 2 months in a silence that had long since stopped being uncomfortable and become something else entirely. Something that felt more than anything else she had experienced in her adult life, like enough. After supper, Caleb pushed back from the table and looked at her. "I need to tell you something," he said. She set down her coffee cup. His face had the expression she had learned to read as meaning he had been holding something for a while and had decided the holding was finished. "All right. I wrote to the county land office last week," he said, "before we left for Helena." She waited. "About the property deed." He kept his eyes on her. "I filed an amendment." A pause. "What kind of amendment?" "The kind that adds a second name," he said, "to the ownership record." The room was very quiet. Evelyn looked at him across the table. She looked at this man who had built a ranch in the mountains for a woman he had loved and lost, who had spent 7 years turning grief into work and silence, into a way of being, who had told her she could stay for 1 week, and then never mentioned the deadline again, who had held her hand in a courthouse in Helena in front of a federal judge without once looking away. "Caleb," she said carefully, "that's a legal document. I know what it is. You can't, that's not something you undo." "I know that too." She stared at him. "You filed it before the hearing, before we knew how it would go." "Yes." "If Pierce had won, then we'd have lost it together," he said simply. That seemed better. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. Sat with the fact of it, the quiet, enormous fact that this man had put her name on the thing he had been protecting with everything he had before he knew the protection would hold, because he had decided that she belonged in it regardless of outcome. "You should have told me," she said. "I know." He didn't look away. "I was afraid you'd tell me it was too much." "It is too much. I know that too." A long silence. "Caleb Thornton," she said, and her voice had something in it that she didn't try to control. "You are the most stubborn, most deliberate, most—" She stopped, started again. "You could have asked me." "I could have," he agreed. "But asking felt like giving you a chance to say no, and I didn't want you to say no." He said it without apology, without drama, just the plain truth of it, the way he said all his plain truths. "I've been wanting to ask you something else, properly, but I didn't know how to get there from where we were." She looked at him. "So I got there a different way," he said. The summer evening light was doing what Montana summer evenings do, lasting far longer than it had any right to, pressing gold through every window, making everything look like the moment just before something important. "What is it," Evelyn said slowly, "that you actually want to ask me?" Caleb stood up from the table. He was taller than the room always seemed to expect. He came around the table, and he stood in front of her, and he looked down at her with those dark, deep river water eyes that she had been learning to read for 2 months and still wasn't finished learning. He said, "Stay. Not because the land office says so. Not because Pierce says so. Not because of any contract or arrangement or thing that was decided for you." He paused. "Because you choose to." Evelyn stood up. They were very close. "I already told you I wanted to stay," she said. "On the road from Helena. Yes." That wasn't enough. "I wanted to hear it here," he said. "On the ranch, at this table." Another pause. "I wanted to hear it the way things should be said, face to face." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "I choose to stay." He exhaled. It was a small sound, barely audible. But she heard it, and she understood that what it contained was everything he had been carrying since the day she had walked through his gate, the waiting, the guarding, the slow and terrifying process of a man who had been alone for 7 years, allowing himself to need someone again. He reached up and put his hand against her face. She put her hand over his, and that was how it started. Not with grand language, not with dramatic declarations, but with 2 people standing in a kitchen in the long Montana evening, choosing each other with the same deliberate, quiet certainty with which they had chosen everything else that mattered. The federal investigation into Walter Pierce moved with the particular speed of federal investigations, which was to say slowly, but in one direction. It took 4 months. Evelyn knew this because she tracked it not obsessively but carefully, the way you watch a thing you no longer fear, but still need to understand. Dietz wrote twice a month. Garrett's deposition had been entered into the federal record and proved to be more damaging than even Evelyn had anticipated. Pierce had not only falsified the route projections for Thornton Ranch, he had done it for 2 other properties in the county, and once that thread was pulled, the full fabric of what he had been doing for 3 years came apart methodically. The bank board removed him in October. His replacement was a man named Aldous, who rode up to the ranch one Tuesday morning in a buggy with clean wheels, which told Evelyn everything a man who didn't travel rough roads wasn't a man who spent time understanding what the rough roads led to. But Aldous turned out to be someone who understood one thing very clearly. The last bank officer who had tangled with Thornton Ranch was currently facing federal charges. He extended Caleb's loan at a reduced rate and offered a formal written apology for the conduct of his predecessor, which Evelyn accepted on behalf of the ranch and filed carefully with everything else. She filed everything. She had learned from Pierce that paper was power, and that people who kept their documentation lost less than people who trusted memory and handshakes. Caleb watched her build the filing system in the corner of the main room that had previously held a broken chair he'd been meaning to fix for 3 years, and he said, "You're planning to stay a while." "I told you I was staying," she said without looking up from the papers. "You moved out a chair to do it. The chair was broken. I was going to fix it." "You've been saying that for 3 years," she said, and looked up at him with the expression that was both entirely serious and not serious at all. "I needed the space." He looked at the corner. At the neat stacked papers, the labeled boxes she had built from spare wood, the small desk surface she had fashioned from a board, and 2 sawhorses. At the evidence of a person making a permanent home in a space that had previously been a monument to deferred maintenance. "All right," he said. He went back to work. She watched him go, and something in her chest did the thing it did regularly. Now the warm, quiet, almost ache of a happiness so solid, she kept checking to make sure it was real. It was real. Every morning she checked, and every morning it was still there. The first snowfall came early that year. Evelyn woke to it the particular silence of a morning that had been transformed overnight, the quality of light coming through the window that was different from every other light. She had never experienced a Montana winter. She had been vaguely afraid of it, in the way you are afraid of things people warn you about before you've seen them yourself. She got up. She built the fire. She put the coffee on. She went to the window. The mountain was white. Everything was white. The south pasture, which she had been watching for 3 months with the particular attention of someone who had a personal investment in grass, was covered. But underneath it, she knew was the new growth. They had seeded in September, sheltered now by the snow, the way seeds are always sheltered by the things that look like they're burying them. Caleb came out of his room. He looked at the window. He looked at her. "First snow," he said. "I noticed," she said. He came to stand beside her. They looked at the mountain together. After a while, Caleb said, "There's something I want to show you." She looked at him. "Not in winter," he added. "In spring. There's a place on the upper ridge above the tree line. You can see 4 mountain ranges from it on a clear day." He paused. "Clara never made it up there. She was going to, but the winter came early, and then she—" He stopped. "I haven't been up there since." Evelyn was quiet. "But I want to go," he said. "With you. In spring." She looked at him, at the face she had learned the way you learn a landscape in all its weather, all its seasons. At the man who had handed her a coffee cup on the first morning without being asked and had never once looked back. "In spring," she said. "In spring," he agreed. He went to get his coat. She turned back to the window, and here was where the story could have rested, on that moment, on the coffee and the snow and the promise of spring and the upper ridge with its 4-mountain view. It could have rested there and been enough. But there was one more thing. The letter arrived in December. It came from St. Louis, forwarded through the Coldwater Ridge post office, addressed in handwriting she recognized immediately. Her former colleague, a woman named Ruth Alderman, who had taught mathematics at the school and who had been one of the only people who had tried to help Evelyn when Pierce was dismantling everything. She read it at the table. Caleb came in from the barn to find her sitting with the letter in both hands, very still. "What is it?" he asked. She looked up. "The school." He sat down. "The board," she said. After Pierce's investigation after it came out, what he'd been doing, the original ownership of the building was reviewed. The loan that was used to take it was flagged as part of the same pattern. She put the letter down. The court in St. Louis has reversed the original seizure. The school reverts to its pre-loan ownership status. She paused. Ruth says the teachers are still there. The students are still there. Another pause. She says they've been waiting. Caleb was looking at her steadily. "Evelyn," he said, "I know what you're going to say." "Do you?" She looked at him. "You're going to tell me it's my decision." "It is your decision," he said. "But that's not what I was going to say." He leaned forward. "I was going to say, what do you want?" She sat with the question. What did she want? She looked at the letter. She thought about the school, the building she had stood in on summer mornings before the children arrived, the specific smell of chalk and pine floors, and the particular energy of a room full of people who were there because they wanted to understand things. She had loved that school. She had loved it with the fierce, specific love of something built with her own hands from nothing. She looked at the window, at the white mountain. She thought about the cistern, the fence posts, the south pasture coming up green in October, thin and determined, and not impressive yet, but coming. She thought about the upper ridge and 4 mountain ranges, and a promise made for spring. She thought about a hand held across a kitchen table in the dark, and a name added to a property deed before a verdict was in, and one word good said quietly into a summer afternoon. She thought about what it meant to build something. She had built 2 things now. She looked at Caleb. "I want to go back," she said. "Once. I want to see it. I want to make sure Ruth and the others are all right, and that what I built is going to hold." She held his gaze. "And then, I want to come home." The word landed between them the same way it had on the road from Helena. Home. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "How long?" he said. 3 weeks, maybe 4. 4 weeks is a long time. "I know." She looked at him steadily. "I need to know it's standing on its own, that it doesn't need me to survive." She paused. "The same way you needed to know I could survive on my own before you trusted me with anything that mattered to you." He absorbed that. He nodded once. 4 weeks, he said. "And then I'm back," she said. He reached across the table. She gave him her hand. "Right," he said. "Every week." "Every week," she agreed. She left on the first clear day after Christmas, on the stagecoach she had arrived on 6 months before, and this time the town of Coldwater Ridge turned out to see her off. Not because they had always been her friends, most of them hadn't been. But something had shifted in the months since the hearing, the slow social reorientation of a community that had been organized around a man who was no longer organizing anything. Margaret Hale was there, and she squeezed Evelyn's hand and said, "Come back quick. That man of yours doesn't know what to do with himself when you're not on the property." "He was managing fine before I arrived," Evelyn said. "Managing isn't the same as living," Margaret said simply. "Come back quick." Evelyn got on the stagecoach. Caleb was at the gate, not in town. He was not a man for public goodbyes, and she had said goodbye to him at the ranch. He had walked her to the gate. He had not said anything particularly significant. He had put 2 fingers to the brim of his hat in the gesture she had come to know as his particular language for things he meant more deeply than he could say, and she had understood it, and she had walked to the stagecoach. She did not look back. Not because she wasn't feeling it, because she was coming back, and you don't look back at the places you're coming back to. St. Louis was loud. She had forgotten that. Or rather, she had stopped living in it, and so the volume had faded from memory, the way the sound of something familiar disappears, until you step away and return and hear it again all at once. Ruth met her at the station. They held each other for a long moment, and Ruth said into her shoulder, "You look different." "I am different," Evelyn said. "Good different," Ruth said, pulling back to look at her. "Strong different." The school was standing. That was the first thing she needed to know, and she knew it within 5 minutes of arriving. The building was standing, and the teachers were there, and the students were there. Older now by half a year, but otherwise continuous with the students. She had known that particular energy unchanged. Ruth had been running it in her absence, with the competent, slightly frantic energy of someone doing two people's jobs. And the first thing Evelyn did was sit down with her and go through every financial record, every enrollment document, every correspondence with the city board. It took 3 days. At the end of the third day, Evelyn sat back and looked at what they had built together at the evidence on paper of 3 years of work that had survived. Seizure survived. Pierce survived everything. "It's solid," she said. "It's solid." Ruth agreed. It was always solid. Pierce just had better lawyers. "For a while," Evelyn said. Ruth smiled. On the fourth day, Evelyn went to the courthouse. She went. Not because she needed to. The reversal was already filed. The documents were already in order. But because she needed to stand in the room where a judge had once told her that what she had built didn't count, and understand that the room was different now. It was different. She stood in it for 5 minutes. Then she walked out. She wrote to Caleb every week. 4 letters, 1 per week, each one longer than the last. Not because she had more to say, but because writing to him had become the thing she did at the end of each day, the way she had once built fires at dawn and carried water from creeks. The practice of it. The daily address to the person who had become, without either of them planning it, the fixed point she oriented around. His letters back were short. Of course they were. Caleb Thornton was not a man of many words on paper any more than he was in person. But what he wrote was precise. 3 sentences about the South pasture, 1 about the mare's winter coat, 1 about Henderson's wife sending over pie that he had eaten without ceremony. 1 line at the end of each letter, always the same. "Mountain is quiet without you." She read that line 4 times and then folded the letters carefully and kept them in the inside pocket of her coat. The second week, something happened she hadn't expected. A woman came to the school. She arrived without appointment mid-morning, well-dressed, with the particular composure of someone who had made a decision before walking through the door and was not going to reconsider it. Ruth showed her to Evelyn's temporary office, where Evelyn was reviewing enrollment documents, and the woman sat down and put her hands in her lap and said, "I'm Catherine Pierce." Evelyn went very still. "Walter Pierce is my uncle," Catherine said. "I want you to know I'm not here to defend him." She paused. "I'm here because I was one of his investors, one of the people he defrauded with the false land valuations." Another pause shorter. "I lost a significant amount. So did 11 other people." She looked at Evelyn with clear, steady eyes. "I read about the Montana case in the financial papers. I know what you built and what you proved." She opened her bag and produced a card. "I am in the process of forming a coalition of the defrauded investors to pursue a civil action against my uncle's remaining assets." She set the card on the desk. "I would like your help." Evelyn looked at the card. She looked at Catherine Pierce. "What kind of help?" she said. "Documentation," Catherine said. "You are the most documented person in this entire affair. Your filings were the ones that opened the federal case. If you are willing to cooperate with the civil action—" "I need to be clear about something first," Evelyn said. Catherine waited. "My primary interest is Thornton Ranch. The ranch stays intact. Whatever the civil action recovers, Thornton Ranch is not part of the pool. That property has already been removed from any contested assets," Catherine said immediately. The federal ruling was clear. "I want it in writing," Evelyn said. Catherine almost smiled. "You'll have it by tomorrow morning." Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. "I'll help," she said. The civil action documentation took 2 additional weeks. She wrote to Caleb and told him she would be delayed. She told him why. His response came back in 4 days, which was fast for the mail route. It said, "Do what you need to do. Ranch will be here. So will I. And then, mountain is quiet without you." She folded the letter. She finished the documentation. She packed her trunk. She was on the stagecoach north before the January was fully done, and this time the ride felt different in every way from the first, the same roads, the same distances, the same driver on the last leg north through Coldwater Ridge, but none of it the same at all because she was not arriving as someone's consequence. She was not a piece in anyone's plan. She was not running from something or toward a second chance, or any of the desperate, hopeful, terrified things she had been 6 months ago. She was going home. The stagecoach pulled into Coldwater Ridge in the early afternoon of a Thursday, Martha Henderson's good planting day. Evelyn thought and felt herself smile without meaning to. She didn't wait for her trunk. She left it with the driver with instructions to deliver it up the north road, and she walked. She walked the 7 miles. It was cold. January in Montana was serious about itself, and the road was hard-packed, and the mountain ahead was white to the tree line, and she was warm enough in her coat, with her hands in her pockets, and she walked with the specific purpose of someone who knows exactly where they're going. She was half a mile from the gate when she saw him. He was coming down the road on horseback, not hurrying, not running the horse, but moving with clear intention. And when she saw him, she understood that he had been watching the road from somewhere on the property and had come out when he saw her walking. He pulled up. She stopped. They looked at each other. His face was the face she had been writing letters to for 6 weeks, every line of it familiar, every stillness in it readable to her now, the way maps are readable when you've traveled the territory they describe. "You walked," he said. "Stagecoach left my trunk. It's cold." "I know." He got down from the horse. He walked toward her, and she walked toward him, and they met on the road 7 miles north of Coldwater Ridge in the January cold on the mountain that belonged to both of them. And he put his arms around her, and she put her face against his coat, and they stood there for a moment. That was not short. "I'm back," she said. "I know," he said. "I see you." She pulled back and looked at him. "I helped Pierce's investors start a civil action," she said. "I read your letter. It'll take another year to resolve. I figured. I might need to go back once more, for testimony." He nodded. "All right. And I want to write to Ruth regularly. She'll need guidance for the first full year." "Write whatever you need to write," he said. "And I still think the South Pasture needs Evelyn," he said. She stopped. He was looking at her with the expression she had been seeing more often since the evening at the table, the one that had nothing managed about it, the one that was just the thing itself. "You're home," he said. "The rest can wait until morning." She looked at him. She looked at the mountain. She thought about all the things she had built, the school in St. Louis, and the case in Helena, and the documents in Henderson's back room, and the new grass in the South Pasture, and the filing system in the corner where the broken chair used to be. She thought about everything that had been taken from her, and everything she had built back, and the way those two things were different from each other, in a way that mattered enormously. You could lose everything. You could be sent to a mountain by a man who expected you to fail with a trunk and 14 cents and a name on a contract that was designed to humiliate you. You could be told by courtrooms and townspeople and men on horseback and the long grinding weight of ordinary injustice that what you built didn't count and who you were didn't matter. And you could stand up the next morning anyway. You could carry the water and fix the fence and write the letters and speak without permission, in a room where you weren't expected to speak, and you could hold your ground, not because you were certain you would win, but because the ground was worth holding. And sometimes, not always. Not without cost, not without the specific grief of everything the fight required. Sometimes you won. And sometimes the place you won it was the same place where someone had been waiting, not knowing how to wait, building and maintaining and enduring in the patient, stubborn mountain way until the person they didn't know they were waiting for came through the gate. She looked at Caleb Thornton. She took his hand. "Take me home," she said. He turned toward the ranch. She walked beside him. The mountain rose above them, enormous and white and permanent, and the road north was clear, and the gate ahead was open, and on the South Pasture that they had seeded together in September, under 3 inches of January snow, the new grass was waiting for spring. It was coming back. It had always been coming back. And the woman they had sent to break the mountain cowboy, the woman nobody had wanted, the woman Pierce had calculated would disappear. She walked through the gate of Thornton Ranch with her hand in his, and she did not look back. She was already home. And home, it turned out, was not the place you came from. Home was the place you chose and fought for, and built with your own hands, and refused, absolutely and completely refused, to let anyone take from you again.